Here are 3 big tips for a better Session Zero in Dungeons & Dragons. Before we even start playing Dungeons & Dragons, there are a few things we need to decide and discuss with our players as a Dungeon Master, and these don't all need to be decided by the Dungeon Master. The players should definitely have some input, but the Dungeon Master will probably have the final say. All these things are for the players' benefits. Let's get into it. First thing I want to talk about is, what do you discuss in a Session Zero? What's it all about? There are many things you need to outline in a Session Zero that will sort of progress how the game plays. Some basic things like theme and levels of magic and what sort of setting you're playing in are all good to decide in this session. You also might want to talk about combat intensity and whether or not you're going to try and force your players to think outside of the box or take a bit more damage, hit a bit harder, that sort of thing. A little more complicated question can be how much roleplay versus how much combat you want to have. Some players prefer a lot more combat than others, and others prefer a lot more RP. A lot of the time I find with my groups, it's always a pretty good balance of both, and a balance usually helps set a pretty good tone for the whole campaign. A more combat focused game will likely be more gamified, so your players might try and optimize or min-max their characters a lot more, whereas a roleplay heavy campaign might be less inclined to worry about their stats in combat and more inclined to try and improve on their skills as characters. So figure out which one of these you prefer, and remember, whichever one you do, stick with it, because deciding this early on will keep the game true to its intention, having fun. Another thing to discuss during Session Zero is what things are off limits. Are there any topics or situations that players or characters might be uncomfortable with? Are there any triggers or other phobias that people might have? These things are good to steer clear of, and discussing them from the start, very beneficial for the whole table. One simple example I can give is I have a player at my table that is deathly afraid of spiders, so we take them out of the game as often as possible. Because once again, we're all here to have fun, and I don't want to put anyone in a situation that makes them uncomfortable. Do players or the characters have preferred pronouns? Using these words just makes people more comfortable at the table. It's always a good idea. And it's just basic human decency. Another thing to try and reel in during a Session Zero is how often do your players go on tangents? I know some of my players love just having a yarn because they haven't caught up with each other for a few weeks, so we often just kind of wander off into the abyss. Letting players discuss how much they mind this type of behavior early on is a really good thing for your group. If you're okay with having a bit of banter here and there and stopping the game to have a laugh at a comment somebody made, it's perfectly fine. Just make sure that when someone else is getting upset by the fact that the game isn't moving forward, that you all pay attention, respect that player's time, and keep the story going. Remember, everyone's here to kind of escape and dive into a game and get themselves immersed in a fantasy world, and sometimes players can feel a bit detached from that if there's too much out of character banter going on. Another thing to discuss is, do your players really want to be a cohesive group, or do they just want to be their own individual characters? Sometimes players come to the table with an idea of a character they already have, and they really want to play that one specific character. And oftentimes, players come and don't have any idea what they want to play until they get there, and other people will start talking about what they feel like playing. Session Zero is a good place to get all your players together and discuss what they might play, and then all make characters at the same time. This will allow those players to get a good idea of what their role might be in the party, and even perhaps creating backstories with other characters. Interwoven backstories can make some epic adventures, so I highly recommend doing this. And lastly, on this one point of what to discuss in a Session Zero, just how many homebrew rules should you include? This is slightly more on the Dungeon Master to decide, but some players might have some good suggestions, and it's always good if everyone agrees at the table to take in those suggestions and try them out. And if they don't work, get rid of them. Just be sure to mention to your players that homebrew rules aren't always well balanced, and you might have to make a little bit of tweak here and there to some of the wording. This goes not just for general rules, but for individual character rules as well. So some players are playing homebrew classes, perhaps one of their class abilities is either underperforming or overperforming, and it might need to be changed somewhere through the game. As long as your players are aware at the start of the campaign that homebrew rules might need to be tweaked, then it should go smooth enough. All right, the second big thing you want to discuss during a session 0 is homebrew. I know we just slightly touched on it, but I want to expand a bit more into that homebrew. How much and how little can greatly impact pacing and also the length of your adventures. There are plenty of homebrew rules out there for general quality of life adjustments. Maybe crafting is a thing, maybe bonus action drinking potions is a thing, items, spells, combats. There's lots of different rules out there. How much you implement will impact the game's flow if not all the players are very aware of how those rules work in your game. I did just mention it before, but one rule that I pretty much always use is the bonus action potion rule. If you're drinking a potion yourself, it's a bonus action. If you're feeding it to somebody else, it's still an action. It shouldn't be as difficult for yourself to drink a potion as it is to feed it to somebody else, especially since you already know where it is. You can easily flick it out and drink it without even looking. So I tend to scale back how much time it would take. And remember, if some of these homebrew rules that you find aren't improving your game and aren't making it more fun, get rid of it. Another homebrew rule that comes up quite often is crafting things. Players love crafting things. The rule set in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons doesn't do a whole lot of a deep dive into this system. There is small amounts of it in the Xanathar's Guide to Everything, but those aren't super immersive. These crafting rules are often taken from other supplement rulebooks and implemented into games. This can make some parts of the game much slower, but if your characters are invested in finding more pieces to a puzzle, skinning more dragon hides, collecting more parts to clock tower, essentially the gathering and scavenging parts of this, they kinda have to come in tandem with the crafting system. It does add a whole nother aspect of play to the game, but if your players are willing to take it on, and if it's enjoyable, absolutely go for it. Spells are in a similar situation to crafting. Players might want to adjust or conjure their own versions of spells, even if it's just something as simple as reskinning the visual of a spell or maybe changing its area of effect. This doesn't seem too difficult on the surface, but it can get a little bit more complicated the higher the spell level or the more interaction the spell has with more creatures or the environment. This puts a little bit more stress on the DM when it comes to adjusting spells, but if they're happy to help, which as a DM I can tell you adjusting spells is amazing fun, you should definitely try it. A really interesting way to adjust how spells work when you decide to craft something yourself is in the process of creating that spell. The skill check that goes into actually mastering the spell should be decently difficult. It is a pretty difficult thing to do. However, they should still be able to make a spell that perhaps has a chance to miscast. Something simple like the higher the spell level, the easier it becomes to miscast, and miscasting doesn't always have to necessarily make the spell fail. It could just make it do less damage than intended by reducing the damage dice by 1, or if it's a critical failure, perhaps the spell does sort of go a bit haywire. But if you are just looking to change a spell's visual, or maybe its damage type, or maybe just its area of effect, that leads perfectly into my next point. But before that, it would mean the absolute world to me if you guys could hit that like button and subscribe. I'm just getting started here on YouTube and I absolutely need the support to keep going. Motivation is one thing that I can't really do myself very well, but Dungeons & Dragons is literally all I think about all the time. And I want to help new people become dungeon masters so they can have as much fun as I do. I have a Patreon where you can find a bunch of stuff for free. Just join as a free member. You'll get alerts when anything comes out. There's new things coming out every single week. I have magic items, monsters, maps, and blog posts. I also have some stuff up available on the Dungeon Masters Guild sale. You can check out the links down below. I've got some one-shots. I've got a subclass for the reworked Drunken Master Monk. And I've got some pre-generated character packs so that new DMs can just hand these out to their players and try and get started. You can follow me everywhere at Critical Mitts. Alright, back to the video. Where was I? Oh yeah, character customization. And limitations? Not all of the rules of the game are needed for every single game. Some settings or themes require higher levels or lower levels of magic, and some races don't even exist in some campaigns. Or, in their place, there might be completely new ones. In my opinion, limiting races, classes, subclasses, spells, anything that adheres to the theme and the feel of your game is beneficial for you overall. Just know going into the campaign, talk to your players about these things before you decide a setting. Sometimes you just want a group full of casters where the whole world is endowed with magic and even the commoners can cast cantrips and level 1 spells. This allows your players to get more familiar with magic and spells, and you might even want to spice up the spell system entirely. And in that sort of setting, a fighter, a barbarian, what would they be doing there? Everyone uses magic. Ban those classes, get them out of here. It's okay, I give you permission, and if anyone says anything, just blame me. Or perhaps you're just sick of Hexblade Warlocks. Yeah, me too, ban them. If you're having problems with a class or subclass that someone's abusing in previous games, it's okay to say no as a DM. You also have the right to have fun while playing Dungeons & Dragons, and don't forget that. We're trying to have fun playing the game. We're not trying to get bogged down every 20 seconds by someone talking about a rule that's from their race or subclass or something else that incurs a 30-minute discussion about the rules. That's not fun. Talking about force movement versus the sentinel feat, blah, 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 blah. You've all been there before. On a brighter note, some really good ideas can come from character customization. The legacy rules, for example, where you're giving a +2 to one stat and a +1 to another stat for any race, means now that any race can be fairly well optimized for any class or subclass. And I've also got my own personal idea on how to pick races. I had one player who really enjoyed Fire Genasi, but they also really wanted to be an Aarakocra at the same time. And I thought, why don't we just combine the two? So they ended up having a lot of the Fire Genasi legacy traits, but they appeared as an Aarakocra. And if you can guess their name in the comments down below, you win a special prize, I guess? The idea of combining these different things to make something new is what makes Dungeons & Dragons so great. This can be applied to more than just races. It can be applied to classes and weapons and items and spells and virtually anything within the game. So let the players have that green flame blade. I know that's a spell. Or let the players have that purple fireball. Let them use a long sword that has a hook at the end of it. Simply re-visualizing or re-flavoring something, that's so easy to do as a Dungeon Master. If your players are the ones coming up with these ideas and they have this amount of investment in your game, you should be wise to reciprocate that enthusiasm. Whenever my players come up with things like this, it reinvigorates me as a Dungeon Master. And having these things discussed in session 0, you know your players are heavily invested from your game before it's even started. Speaking of getting creative with characters, let's use those backstories they've got to make some epic adventures.